Understanding the acupuncture channels. The twin pillars of understanding both acupuncture theory and embryological growth are qi and channels. Qi is the organising spirit and, as we shall see, behaves like an electrical current. Like all energy, it seeks channels to travel through, and in the body, these become the acupuncture channels. The acupuncture channels were first brought to the attention of the Western world by the work of Georges Soulier de Meuron in the early 20th century. Soulier de Meuron was a Sinophile who translated many Chinese books, including those on history and art. He was, however, neither a doctor nor acupuncturist, but had witnessed the effects of acupuncture during a cholera epidemic and was convinced of its utility. In translating the ancient books on acupuncture, he struggled to translate the Chinese characters of Jing, Luo, Mai into his native French, eventually settling for the words meridians. His work was hugely influential and introduced acupuncture to a large Western audience. Unfortunately though, meridians was a poor translation and added almost nothing to our understanding of the structure. In fact, as we will see, this well-meant translation possibly hindered the understanding of acupuncture theory in the West more than any other single act. As with much of Chinese medicine, to get to grips with these concepts, it is helpful to look at the characters themselves. What is understood as acupuncture channels, or erroneously and henceforth never used again, meridians, is from the Chinese Jing, Luo, Mai. We will examine each character in detail to understand it. Mai, a network. Mai is the last word in Jing, Luo, Mai and is a word that is common to all of the other channel networks. For example, Du Mai, Ren Mai, Chong Mai. Mai is drawn as flesh and streams. The first radical is flesh, being hung on a hook, and is used to signify being a part of the body. Most of the characters for the organs contain this radical too. The second radical is drawn as the tributaries of a river. Mai is often translated into the English word vessel or pulse, but this doesn't do the character justice. The tributaries within the drawing demonstrate it is actually many vessels, more like a network than one single vessel. A network also describes how the body is physically and energetically organised. Furthermore, the word Mai is used for not just the 12 main channels, but also the extraordinary channels, and so is describing a general property of how qi moves, rather than a specific aspect related to the Jing Luo. As such, this author believes network is the most accurate translation for Mai, and will use this from henceforth. The Jing Luo network. The first characters, Jing and Luo, are drawn as follows. As with much of Chinese writing, these little squiggly lines are so much more than they first appear. In fact, they are small stories that have been carefully crafted. You may have noticed that the first part of each character is identical, so let's start here. This character is called Si and is the origin of the English word silk. It is drawn as a fine thread woven into a fabric. Interpretation of this character often leads to the simple translation as silk, but when placed in context, as all of the characters must be, This is a mistake. It was this character which made Soulier de Meuron think of the warp and woof of a fabric that then led to the word meridians. Specifically though, the character refers to any thread that is woven into a fabric. And what the Chinese were describing was something within our bodies. Within the context of our body, there is something that is very similar to silk, but that remains hidden from the surface. This substance, which is found everywhere within the body, looks like silk, is woven like silk, and is almost as strong as silk. This substance is fascia. Fascia, connecting the body. Fascia is everywhere within our bodies and is especially acknowledged by surgeons for conveniently dividing the body up, although it has been given little importance outside of its structural role. Unfortunately, though, even the very word fascia is poorly defined, which somewhat limits our comprehension. Terminology is important as it allows us to agree on what we are discussing. The word fascia is increasingly being used as a word to describe the connective tissue network in our bodies. This network creates a three-dimensional web within the body that supports and holds it in place. Technically, the connective tissue network includes bones, tendons, and cartilage, and there is good evidence from both Eastern and Western points of view that these are a continuous system. The main thing that unites all of these structures is that their principal ingredient is collagen. From a Western viewpoint, the bones are composed of the same type 1 collagen as fascia and emerge from the same embryological layer of mesoderm. They clearly connect the body together and provide structural support. However, beyond this, both fascia and bones are understood to add little more to the function of the body. From an Eastern point of view, bones and fascia are both intimately connected, but bones are also seen to store kidney energy and something called essence. Fascia then plays a role in spreading this around the body through the triple burner, which is essentially the organ of fascia. Together, this system and its ability to both warm and tonify the body is talked about as ministerial fire and is discussed later. Hence, this system is far more complex and important than having a purely structural role. The connective tissue network is a poorly understood and researched aspect of Western medical science. This is mainly because it was considered to only have a structural role within the body, hence the terminology, connective tissue. Erroneous as discussed, connection with qi is the critical aspect for 100 trillion cells in the body, and it is this tissue that allows this. With further study, it will become clear that the concepts of Jing-Lua is a more complete understanding of this connective tissue network. But in the meantime, looking at the microstructure of fascia is useful. Essentially, fascia consists of a matrix. A matrix can be understood as the environment that the body creates to allow the organs and cells to function within it. In a jellyfish, it is the jelly itself that is the matrix. In humans, our cells also reside in a jelly, but at a more sophisticated level. In fascia, the cells that live within this matrix appear to be there to create and support it, and to do that they secrete collagen, elastin, and the jelly itself. Collagen. Collagen is the most common protein in fascia and also the most common protein in the body. comprising about 30% of total body protein. Collagen gives fascia something that is well accepted, enormous strength, plus something that is more esoteric but explains important aspects of the Jing-Lua network and triple burner, piezoelectricity. Collagen creates the strength throughout the connective tissue network for bones, fascia, and even into the delicate structure of organs. It could be considered to be the scaffolding material of the body and is, in fact, as strong as steel per dry weight. Collagen is created from the amino acids glycine and proline, which are themselves made in the liver. This has important implications for the relationship of the liver with collagen and also this network. Just like silk, the radical used in Jing-Lua, collagen is light yet incredibly strong. The tensile properties of collagen are well understood by modern science, but what has been largely ignored is its electrical and piezoelectric properties. Piezoelectricity is the ability for crystals to create electricity when deformed. Collagen is semi-crystalline as it has repeating orders of molecules in 2 dimensions rather than 3. This still means that it is able to generate a charge when deformed, and it is believed that this charge then governs, amongst other things, the ossification of bone. Little is known about this property apart from the fact it exists. For example, the conditions that allow the generation of electricity, the effect of the orientation of fibres on charge, the effect of pathology on this, and even the consequential effect on the cells remains poorly understood and poorly studied by modern Western medical science. This appears to be a phenomenal oversight in a body that runs on electricity, with everything from the mitochondrial cascade that creates ATP to the ion pumps on the cell membrane through to the cardiac pulse that keeps us alive, using electricity to drive the process. Chinese medicine, through the concept of qi, has well-worn and consistent ideas about the generation of electricity by connective tissue. They consider the fascial web to be an organ in its own right and call it the triple burner, partly because it generates heat. It is worth making an important distinction at this point between what is known as the triple burner and what we are discussing here, which is the Jing-Lua network. Whilst the distinctions are not completely clear-cut, the triple burner can be understood as the fascia itself and the Jing-Lua as the potential spaces it produces in the body. If the triple burner was like the fabric of your house, the Jing-Lua network would be the pathways or the spaces you walk through within the house. These spaces between fascia go on to perfectly explain the acupuncture channels, physiologically, anatomically, and even embryologically. The house analogy can be extended to the idea that the house has 3 levels, and that the rooms on each level are connected and share an environment. These are the 3 burners, and the rooms between them, even if they may appear to be separate, are connected and also share humidity and temperature. The top layer could be hot and dry, whilst the bottom was cold and damp, and this is the case with the body too. Collagen, and the fascia of which it is the principal ingredient, becomes much more than a passive structural component of the body in this model. Collagen constantly transforms and changes as a result of the electrical forces, or qi, generated within the body, and is constantly creating, transforming, and changing qi. However, the Chinese words Jing-Lua and triple burner are better words for fascia in the spaces because these are more accurate and precise in what they are describing. These words have been coined specifically for these concepts, rather than simply accidentally fitting them, and in the case of fascia, being forced into a description that is not quite what it was designed for. Fascia also contains two other important ingredients that explain much about its qualities: elastin and the jelly fluid. Elastin provides an elastic quality to fascia that allows it to return to its original shape. This is very important for fascia's structural role and plays a part in the role of massage and how this helps the body. The Chinese form of massage is called Tui Na, which literally translates as push and grasp. Elastin means that the fascia comes back to the same place it started, so stiffness always suggests a problem with this. Destruction of elastin will make the fascia dry and brittle, a property which sounds similar to the Chinese pathological concept of dryness. Dryness will result in the tissues becoming physically dry, with patients reporting they feel dry and possibly hot with it, and their body's less elastic or flexible. The jelly. The collagen and elastin give strength, electricity or qi, and elasticity to the fascia, but it is still the gel that makes up the bulk of the matrix. This gel acts like a shock absorber, transmitting forces around the fascia and, critically, providing the optimum environment for the fibres of collagen and elastin. When this gets dehydrated, the fibres suffer. In the comb jellyfish, which is in fact the ancestor of all animals, this watery gel makes up most of its jelly and gives the jellyfish some structural support. As animals become more advanced and fish emerged, they developed condensed areas of collagen called cartilage. These provided more structure and enabled support for muscles of locomotion, which translated into more success, including the ability to predate. In land animals, the cartilage needed to be firmer and more rigid to withstand the incessant forces of gravity. In order to do this, the cartilage was ossified by the addition of calcium hydroxyapatite to the collagen fibres. This had the result of binding them together and creating stiffness. The tensile strength, however, still came from the collagen. Hence, the cartilage emerged from the gel as condensations of collagen to create a superjelly support. Then a crystalline superstructure was added to this, tying together the collagen to create even more rigidity, and so bones were formed. This latter process is driven by electrical charges generated by movement of the collagen. This means that bone should be understood as a crystallized form of fascia. Physical organisation of fascia. The name fascia comes from the Latin to bind together and has the same origin as fascism. In fact, the fasces were bound together wooden poles with an axe between them, and this motive is still in use in the US House of Representatives. In the body, fascia is so named because it binds together the cells and tissues. Finding the space between the fascia is the guiding principle behind anatomical dissection, whether done by a surgeon on a person or an anatomist on a cadaver. These are the same planes a butcher will use to cleave apart the body of an animal to create joints, and the same natural divisions that you can see in well-cooked meat. The fascia is there to neatly divide up the body, so that things know where they are supposed to be. The fascia remains essentially the same throughout the body, but constantly subdivides it to create smaller and smaller units. The result is that the function and structure of fascia look almost the same whether you look at it microscopically or macroscopically. The entire fascial network should be considered as an organ in its own right. At the most basic level, the body can be understood as being constructed of cells. The inside of these cells is incredibly complicated and exceptionally well organised, and each should be considered a miniature life form. In fact, if our body is a society, then each cell could be seen as a person within that society. To understand how society works, you wouldn't need to understand how the insides of each person worked. What is more critical is the relationships between the people. Thankfully, for the sake of our understanding, this is the case within our bodies too. Whilst the intracellular life is fascinating and important, we are more concerned with the relationship between cells that are mediated by qi. If we drew this at a cellular level, we could represent it like this, with cells that are surrounded by lymph, which then flow into lymphatic pathways lined by collagen and fascia. One obvious question may be, where is the blood? Blood is a special fluid that lies within its own compartment of Shaoyin and is walled off from the cells by the endothelium that lines the blood vessels. As such, whilst blood nourishes and moistens, it does not directly contact the cells, but rather does it through the lymph. Western histological description tends to ignore the lymph and qi, dismissing it as ubiquitous and uninteresting. Thus, the accepted picture looks more like this, with the lymph and certainly qi vaporized. Furthermore, as the cells are now dead and dehydrated, the final histological picture looks more like this. In histological slides, collagen is stained red so as to be visible. When scaled upwards to see the tissues rather than the cells, we see pictures that are normally rich in this red staining. In tissues, the individual cells' functions can start to be ignored, and rather their role in society seen. Whilst these tissues show up the fascia, the connective tissue network, what this process has missed is the water or lymph that sits within this space in health. Preparing the tissues for microscopy means killing, freezing and using other techniques that results in these spaces collapsing and disappearing. What you are left with is the collapsed walls of the structure, which bear only a passing resemblance to their functional state. Even more importantly, the energy is completely gone, whereas in life these cells would be pulsing with qi. Histology and anatomy have been brilliant at describing what is in the body, but they have completely ignored the space between things. Jing as a fascial pathway. The first part of the character, the Jing, translates as fascia or collagen. When we look at the second radical in the character Jing, it adds more to the meaning. This radical represents underground rivers which were associated in both Chinese law and within this character of carrying magical or divine qualities. The process of finding these rivers and awareness that energy flowed through the earth too was known as feng shui, or in the West, geomancy. Whilst the character means underground, again we must contextualize it. The ancient Chinese saw that the microcosm mirrored the macrocosm, a feature which is illustrated on the cover of this book. The ground that is represented in this picture is that of the body, and in this case it is the surface or skin. Underground means deep, and this is in the same context in which anatomical science explains deep, and so these are deep rivers. The drawings in the character Jing represent deep rivers of fascia carrying water. These rivers, as the second part of the character intuits, carry not just water but also mystical spiritual energy, which is qi. This elegant description of the body's fascial network is a perfectly succinct way to describe not only the system's physical form but also its function. The fascial coverings of the body are generally ignored within Western science and medicine because they are so thin, ubiquitous, and apparently have little purpose beyond structural integrity. Within surgical practice, these fascial coverings are the bedrock for surgeons who will go to great lengths to be able to move along these rivers within the body. This is the basis of not only good surgical practice, but all keyhole surgery. It is well accepted that serious disease erupts when these layers are breached, for instance in the spreading of infection or, most pertinently, cancer. These fascial coverings extend in a continuous layer throughout the body, much like a spider's web but in 3 dimensions. They also extend into the bones and organs. It is difficult to illustrate the web without the structures it supports because it is everywhere. However, it can be seen in every anatomical illustration ever made. If, for example, we examine an anatomical drawing of the body from Gray's Anatomy 1918, we can see the deep rivers of fascia. Here, in the thigh, there are multiple strands of fascia visible as white lines dividing the muscles. They all tend to run from the skin towards the centre and ultimately the bone. As to be expected in a Western conventional anatomy textbook, the author is concerned with labelling the things rather than the spaces, i.e. he has ignored the space and fascia. If we take the same image of the thigh, remove all the labelling of the things and instead highlight the spaces, we see a different picture where the spaces can take centre stage. These spaces which lie between things are the channels, and specifically the Jing network. In death, the lymph is squeezed out, leaving the fascia, but in life, there would be far more fluid. We can now map the surface description of the channels onto the thigh to see how the channels correspond perfectly. The meaning of the second part of the character Jing is deep or under the skin. And here we are looking under the skin at the water passages between tissues. These channels are fully covered in part 3, but the understanding that the Jing network consists of the macroscopic fascial pathways within the body is very important. It also leads us to a place where there are naturally far more fascial planes than there are official Jing network channels. This can be seen in this picture. The official Jing channels number 6 in each limb. These are the 6 embryological planes of the body explored in part 3, which then each move into the arm and leg, making 12 channels in total. To be consistent, each limb then should contain 6 clear acupuncture channels which exist as fascial planes. However, there are clearly more than this. This anomaly does not cause any contradictions with the Chinese description of acupuncture channels, and in fact deepens our understanding. The 6 main channels are just that, the main ones. They correspond to 6 planes within the body which then emerge into the limbs like jam squeezing out between the layers of a Swiss roll. Underneath these main channels there are smaller channels which, while smaller, are still fascial rivers. These continue to branch and reduce in size until we reach the tiniest intracellular channels. The reason that the acupuncture channel system is described as both Jing and Luo is because, although there is a continuous spectrum between the tiniest channels and the largest channels, there is a functional difference occurring at both ends of this spectrum. The characters contain clear differences which correspond to this. An analogy may be useful. The rivers of the Jing Mai are like the major rivers of the earth. When we map them, we tend to create artificial boundaries that don't really exist in nature. For example, here is a picture of the Amazon basin. As you can see, there is a huge multitude of rivers which fan inwards to create an ever larger river. However, there is no clear single river until it is marked as such on a map by us. As you may remember, the second part of the character my, which we have translated as network, is drawn in a similar way to this. The reason this waterway within the Amazon basin was chosen was that it is the largest tributary at any given point. However, it is clearly erroneous to think that this is what constitutes the river. Without the multitude of waterways draining into it, the Amazon River would be a mere fraction of what it is. We've created this river in order to name, map and navigate it. However, it is artificially restrictive in its scope. Chi flows like water, and physics states that water will prefer the path of least resistance along the largest channels, i.e. the easiest way. That isn't to say that this is the only way it can travel through. If you give water two pathways to travel down, more water will preferentially choose the larger, less resistant pathway, but it will still travel down both. This is what is happening in these apparently unused or unmapped spaces in the body. They are just being used less preferentially. Anatomy of the Jing network. The Jing channels are surrounded on both sides by fascia, which creates avenues for qi to flow down. As stated, these pathways are easily visible in any anatomy textbook. There can be no doubt about their existence, as it is the most fundamental principle of both anatomical and surgical dissection. As well as the surgeon's finger, blood, fluid or qi can flow down these pathways too, and it is this quality that has allowed us to map them out. Anatomically speaking, the most obvious of the Jing channels are the peritoneal cavity, the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. These three cavities are a good introduction to the basic structure and physiology of the channels and are commonly used for keyhole surgery. The peritoneum in the abdomen and the pleural cavity in the chest. Although separate cavities, these three spaces within the body originally started off as a single space known as the coelomic cavity. This is the Zhuoyan channel and is covered in more depth within part 3. Whilst anatomists have named these cavities, this is misleading. Cavity suggests a space within the body, which does dovetail with acupuncture theory. However, these spaces are actually channels. A cavity is simply an empty space, whereas these spaces contain a viscous fluid which flows in a circuit, like a river. In the case of the peritoneal channel, it follows the route shown here, and ends underneath the liver before draining through the diaphragm. In liver failure, this flow becomes blocked and the channel fills up with fluid, causing ascites. Importantly, these channel not only fluid but also qi. The coelom, which forms this channel, is a huge potential space that goes from the top of the torso to the bottom. All of the other Jing channels have the same basic physiology, which consists of a space between two fascial planes, but they are often more difficult to see. In the case of the bladder channel, for example, this is the remains of an embryological bladder that physically disappears in utero. The heart channels are easy to see since they are the major arteries. The spleen channel lies sandwiched between the peritoneum and retroperitoneum. Blood or fluids take as they track down the abdomen. The exact location of each channel will be covered later, but for the purpose of clarity and simplicity now, they can be represented graphically as here, with the blue in the middle representing qi flow. The channels are physical continuations of the organs, or more accurately, the organs are condensations of matter around the channels. If we were to graphically place the organ within the channel, it could be drawn as here. Here is the lung with its associated messenger organ, the thyroid gland at the top. The lung qi flows up to the voice box and thyroid and then into the channel. The channel of the lung is, by convention, represented in yellow, but if we looked more closely at this, we would see it is the space between two planes of fascia. In this space, in this case between the muscles of brachioradialis and pronator teres in the forearm, flows qi. A brief introduction to the 6 divisions. As an aside, the reason that in traditional English texts on Chinese medicine the lung organ is capitalized is because the Chinese description of the organs is really the entire upper or lower end of one of these embryological planes. In the case of the lung, this also includes the thyroid and lining of the upper respiratory tract and especially the nose. Without this deeper understanding, the broad functions of the lung within Chinese medicine make little sense, and so capitalizing the organ was a way to convey this greater meaning. Thankfully, once we understand the difference between the physical organ and its role within this embryological plane, we can dispense with this capitalization. However, we then need to introduce these planes to enunciate this higher level of organization. This is important and necessary. What we are going to find is that the description of the body as 6 embryological and hence anatomical planes not only explains physiology but also creates a more complete, more accurate and much simpler model of the body. This revolutionizes our understanding. Unfortunately, like qi and xingluo, there are simply no English words which describe these. The germ cell layers of embryology come close, ectoderm, mesoderm and endoderm, but these are primitive layers that fail to keep up with the increasing complexity of the body that vertebrates establish and humans exhibit. As a result, we need to use the names the Chinese have given, and these are Taiyang, Shaoyang, Yangming, Taiyin, Shaoyin, and Zhuiyin. All the author can do is apologise for these new words to learn and promise that, in the end, it simplifies things. At this point, it is worth clarifying an aspect of the network that is possibly confusing. That is the subtle difference between the channel system and the layer of cells that surround it. This topic is explored in the Shanghan Lun, or the Treatise on Cold Damage, a 2nd century medical classic. In the Shanghan Lun, the channel system is talked about in terms of these 6 divisions. The characters used to describe these divisions is Jing, the exact same character that we now know so well as channels. Interestingly, learned discussion of this book and the references to this character have come to the independent, from myself anyway, conclusion that what this character represents in these writings is subtly different to the normal translation of Jing, what we understand as fascial channels. Rather than channels, the received wisdom is that it means conformations. The Oxford English Dictionary defines conformations as the shape or structure of something, especially an animal. What the Shanghan Lun is saying then is that within our body there are 6 structures or shapes or 6 conformations that have folded amongst themselves to make the body. What this also means is that the channels exist between or possibly within these conformations, in the space that exists to enable things to grow and order to reign. An analogy that could be used is that of Russian dolls. Russian dolls contain multiple different sized dolls which all slide perfectly into each other, leaving a tiny amount of space on either side. From the outside there appears to be just one layer, but if a cross section was obtained we would see that there were in fact 6, for example. The same is true of the body. From the outside we look solid, but inside we are composed of multiple layers. These layers can be visualized by carefully analysing CT and MRI scans of the body. As is the case with most of Western medicine, the scans are more concerned with things rather than the spaces between the things. Furthermore, these potential spaces are almost invisible on these scans and are only marked out, if at all, by a thin layer of fascia. Here, a CT scan of the body through the levels of kidneys and liver with the organs labelled. As you can see, all of the organs are clearly visible. Now, instead of concentrating on the organs, if we concentrate on the spaces between things, we see a different picture. In this image, we've removed the detail of the organs and instead highlighted the layers between them. There is a little more complexity in the interrelation between layers and areas, but in essence this is accurate. Good surgeons understand these layers well because they want to move along them rather than across them. These layers are all performing particular roles and then interrelating with each other in very precise ways. The layers also extend into the chest and pelvis and by extension into the arms and legs, creating the 12 channels. Viewed in cross-section, or the transverse plane, the channels form a pattern crudely resembling a Russian doll. Equally, the cover of this book is another demonstration of the 6 divisions. Neither of these representations is complete, but it starts to build an idea of how the channels interrelate. The importance of this is that whilst the body can be understood as being composed of 6 divisions, each of these layers can be understood as a channel around which cells are organising through qi. Acupuncture can then affect these channels and the cells. Loi and histology. Jing and Loi are 2 separate words though. So why have the Chinese described this system with 2 rather than 1 word? Looking at the character for Loi reveals more. We should recognise the first radical in this character as Si or silk, and we understand that this translates better as collagen or fascia. The second part of the character means net. Furthermore, in the context of this specific character, the second part is accepted as subtly changing the meaning of Si further. Here, instead of meaning silk woven into a fabric, like fascia, it represents unreeled silk or stringy fibres. In the body, the most obvious fibres making up 30% of our total body protein is collagen. Putting this together, the best translation of this Chinese character Loi is into collagen net. The collagen net is the microscopic structural support network of our body that was visible earlier as the red stained structures in microscopic slides. Collagen is ubiquitous and immensely important in our bodies, being found in just about every microscopic examination of cellular structure. Collagen isn't an intracellular protein though, it is an extracellular protein, which means that it is organising the relationship between cells. The study of the way in which our cells are grouped together to make tissues is known as histology and is performed with a microscope. Whereas anatomy is the macroscopic structure of our bodies, histology is the microscopic structure. And, just as Jing and Loi are separate, Western science has deliberately distinguished these as different. Incredibly, for our understanding, the word histology comes from the Greek root histo, which translates as web, or the warp of a fabric. The 19th century anatomists who coined this word did so because the structure of the tissues under the microscope resembled a woven web, just as luo is literally drawn as a woven net. Eastern and Western are in complete accordance. Like fascia, the collagen network is again mainly ignored because at a superficial level it appears to lack any function other than support. In fact, this network of collagen is incredibly important and is also continuous with the macroscopic fascia. The physical structure of collagen and fascia is so important that it is in essence another organ, what the Chinese call the triple burner. The luo, then, is not so much the network of collagen that permeates down to a cellular level, but rather the spaces that this creates within the body. Unlike the spaces of the Jing channels, these are difficult to visualize as they are occurring at the microscopic level. Furthermore, the forces that operate at this level, especially the surface tension of water, will tend to keep these channels collapsed unless life is pulsing through them. Instead of the pink-stained world of collagen visible in microscopic slides, in life the cells would be more representative of the illustration here, with an ever-present flow of water and qi occurring between them. The flow starts between cells but then grows larger and broader like a river basin. Together, luo and jing create a continuous network that moves from the microscopic to the macroscopic, from histology to anatomy, from the invisible to the visible, from cells and tissues to organs, muscles and bones. Specifically, luo and jing are the spaces formed by this network of fascia and collagen, the spaces that allow qi to flow between them. If an analogy was made with the earth, rivers and the movement of water, then qi flow through the luo is the percolation of water through the soil and the small streams, and jing, the flow of water through the rivers. This division that the Chinese have made between jing and luo makes sense, even though in reality this represents part of a whole, the space within the connective tissue network. There is a tangible and clinical difference between the fascia that surrounds and encases organs and the fine collagenous net or web that surrounds cells and supports tissues. They are linked yet separate, and hence why they are called jing and luo. Now we have the network that the Chinese describe, concordant with our Western understanding and consisting of qi flowing from small into ever-enlarging vessels. Qi moves differently within the jing and luo, but it remains the same qi. Luo points activate the luo channels. One of the types of acupuncture points that is found on the channels is called a luo point, and this gives us another way to understand the luo channels. The character used is exactly the same in both point and channels. Luo points are found on each of the main channels and are often very useful points. They are used when we wish to transfer energy or possibly a pathological substance from a jing channel to its yin-yang organ pair. It does this through the tiny connecting luo channels that are particularly strong at these points. The jing channels tend not to directly contact with other jing channels, with each of the 6 channels behaving somewhat independently. At a physical level, this can be seen in, for example, the function of the arterial system, Xiaoyin, lymphatic system, Xiaoyang, and intestines, Taiyin. They are separate systems but also connected. The jing channels do meet and share information and substances, but they also connect at a deeper level through the luo. This connection could be represented graphically as here. These luo points acting through the lower channels allow the paired yin-yang organs, e.g. Tai Yang and Shao Yin or Yang Ming and Tai Yin, to balance themselves via the transfer across these tiny channels. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on understanding the acupuncture channels. As you can see, the Jing-Lua system, the acupuncture channels, are clearly visible in our anatomical representations of the body within Western medicine. Please do support my work by having a look on my website. The pages from this lecture are from the Uncharted Body hardback edition, which you can see here. And this lecture is just one chapter or 10 pages within 300 pages of the book. And the book goes further into explaining exactly how acupuncture practice works and why it's so powerful.